east-west. Today, I want to talk a little bit about the southern end, thinking of what's south of the Roman Empire. Earlier, we had talked about the Nubians and how they had dealt with Egypt even during the Roman period. Now, there is, in addition to the Silk Road, there is a second trade route that starts from Egypt and goes to the east. Now, this one, though, is not by land but by sea. And it begins with merchants from Egypt sailing south down the Red Sea, as they've been doing since the time of Hatshepsut, to southern Arabia and East Africa. Around 150 BC, some of these Egyptian merchants discovered something that would really change the way trade was done. They discovered that the monsoon winds in the Indian Ocean were very regular, arriving virtually every year on exactly the same day, lasting almost exactly the same amount of time, blowing for 6 months west to east and then reversing east to west. Now, the monsoon brings massive amounts of rain with it, and these Egyptian merchants realized that they could sail just ahead of the monsoon itself, arrive in southern India with a few days to unload their ships before the monsoon arrives, then wait out 6 months and sail back home when the winds reverse. This would enable them to trade quickly, regularly, and confidently from Egypt down the Red Sea and then across the Indian Ocean. This allowed not just trade with India, but also with other sea trades that were linking into southern India, bringing goods from Southeast Asia and the islands of Indonesia to India, all of these being traded for spices like black pepper, which only grows through southern India, cotton, which at this point is only grown in India, cinnamon coming from Sri Lanka, as well as more exotic spices from what's now Indonesia. In return, they would take gold, especially from Africa and Europe, as well as silk from China and other goods. Now, by the time we get to Augustus, this trade has increased to such an extent that there are about 120 very large ships sailing every year in this trade between the Roman Empire and India. And we can see some evidence of sort of long-distance trade just by looking at some of the things found in Pompeii. The painting shows a woman wearing a silk gown. The statue, the goddess Lakshmi, is made in India of an Indian goddess and was displayed in the home of a wealthy merchant in Pompeii, showing, if nothing else, artwork from India was arriving in small cities in southern Italy no later than August 24th, 79 AD. Now, among the other products that the Romans got were sugar, which at this point was not known west of India, lemon, citrus fruit, all these spices. The Indians were interested in Roman wine as well as gold. And the volume of it's so great that there were permanent settlements of Roman merchants in what's now India. At a place called Arikamedu, there's even been found a town built in Roman style with Roman buildings from 2nd century AD. Reasonably sized town that would have been lived in by Roman merchants who come from Egypt and beyond. and stayed in this town during the 6 months they were awaiting the monsoon to reverse. Um, some clearly would have stayed 12 months. And from India, Roman merchants are known to have sailed even further, with Roman ships arriving on the coast of China by the middle of the second century. The trade route from Egypt down the Red Sea and across the Indian Ocean to southern India would spread Judaism. Because of course Alexandria in Egypt is one of the largest centers of the Jewish community, and later on Christianity. And even now, if you look, there are major Jewish communities, or were until the 1940s, in Yemen and Ethiopia, and in exactly those towns of South India where one would be carried by the monsoon winds. The oldest Christian churches in India are in those same towns. Allegedly, Christianity arrives there in the middle of the first century, while there are also Christian communities set up in Yemen and Ethiopia, following the same trade route. Now, not only was trade being carried on from Egypt down the Red Sea to India, but also further south down the African coast. And we have a remarkable document called Periplos of the Erythraean Sea. The Erythraean Sea is the name given in Greek to what we call the Red Sea that gives rise to the modern country of Eritrea. Now, this describes the various towns along the sea coast all the way to India and southbound the African coast as far as the place called Raqqa. Describes towns like Apone and Malau during modern Somalia, and what you can get there like myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, all sorts of exotic animals, because of course the Romans had a constant demand for exotic animals for use in various arena games, as well as slaves. We also see these towns that go much further south, down to a land, to the city of Raqqa, in a land that's called Azania. According to the Periplos, it is ruled by a governor. The city of Raqqa is ruled by a governor who comes from the kingdom of Sabah in South Arabia, also known to us sometimes as the kingdom of Sheba. The king of Sabah was a client who recognized the authority of the Roman emperor. The governor in Raqqa, which is probably down there at the most southern yellow dot, southern Tanzania, was in some sense part of the Roman Empire, which is very, very interesting. We're very, very far from it. According to the Periplos, Azania exports ivory and gold and is friendly to Romans. This is the first description of land south of the equator in Africa, and some of the connections to this will play on who the people of Raqqa are, who the people of Azania are. We play on much later with other groups like the Lemba and the Shona, who still live in that region today. Now, west of Egypt, the Romans took over from the Carthaginians, dominance along the North African coast. The Carthaginians, outside the immediate area of Carthage itself, tended to stay pretty close to the sea. The Romans would expand much further inland than the Carthaginians ever, bringing kingdoms of Numidia and the two kingdoms of Mauritania into the empire, and in that way, bringing the coastal areas, the areas north of the desert, from the Atlantic all the way to Egypt into a single state. As one moves back from the coast in North Africa, hit the mountains, especially in Algeria and Morocco, the Atlas Mountains, and on the other side of the mountains, there were the kingdoms of the Maori, also known to us as Moors, Berbers, or Amazigh. They had their own kings, but those kings would recognize the Roman emperor as their supreme ruler. Sometimes they would even have direct Roman governors. From North Africa, we know the Romans ventured even further. We have specific descriptions of 4 different exploratory missions the Roman military sent out, reaching all the way down to Lake Chad, on the borders of Nigeria, to the Niger River in Mali, and to the Senegal River in Senegal. Other Roman expeditions of exploration were sent to find the source of the river Nile, so Romans may have reached modern Uganda, Tanzania, overland, as well as reaching Tanzania and Kenya by sea. These reports bring back to the Mediterranean and in writing some real concept of what's going on the other side of the Sahara. And while exploration is increasing, trade is increasing. Early on in the Roman period, camels really begin to appear in North Africa. And the advent of the camel means it's suddenly much, much easier to get from one side of the Sahara to the other, carrying goods, trading products from the Mediterranean down to the lands on the other side of the desert. This picture is one from Egypt from the 5th century, showing merchants loading and unloading camels. As you can see, there are people in this picture from, both white and black people, which is kind of interesting, as well as fairly recognizable camels. Now, this trans-Saharan trade would be heavily dominated by one group, Berbers or Maori, though the Romans give them a different name. They call them the Garamantes. Probably called it something themselves, something like Karama. They had a written language related to the other languages of Northern Africa. Their writing system was based on Phoenician, and they lived in the extreme south of what's now Libya and Niger. They had at least 8 large cities based in the oases, deep in the desert. There are hundreds of castles and stations they had throughout the Sahara. These were being explored heavily by archaeologists until about 10 years ago, when the government of Libya collapsed and civil war began there. I know a guy who was evacuated out as Libya fell apart, who was digging in one of these cities. Now, the Garamantes would dominate the trans-Saharan trade for centuries. We know they became Christians fairly late, and we know 569, and we know that they had pretty good relations with the Romans. Occasionally, they fought. We know that people coming from this deep Saharan land later on would arrive further north in Roman Africa. Now, if we go further down in the valley of the Niger and the Sahel, we know that the Garamantes were trading with cities on both sides of the desert. However, unlike the Garamantes or the people further north, we do not have really good written accounts of these areas, and the archaeology has been barely done. We know that towns and cities started to emerge in the Tunisia region by 2000 BC. You know, they had farming, the main crops were millet and sorghum. And that, as the Sahara expanded, they had moved further south. You know of cities like Genignano and Kumbisala, both of which had formed, you know, probably around the time Rome and Carthage were first going to war. But not enough is known. This is one of those areas that archaeologists should really find out more for us. The first kingdom that we can really be confident of in this region grow up with Kumbe Salah as its capital. It called itself either Aukar or Ouagadougou, and was ruled by a man who was known as the Ghana. Usually it is called Ghana in most descriptions. This is the first great empire of Western Africa. It is the least known because we really don't have more than very fragmentary written records until around the year 1000. We'll come back to them when we're discussing the medieval period. Now, south of the Sahel, you hit the rainforest. And unfortunately, in ancient times, other than the very, very few mentions of explorers in the Roman Empire, in the Phoenicians, almost nothing survives in writing before about the year 600, the people beyond the Sahel. People beyond the Sahel, communication generally with the people of the Mediterranean would have gone through the cities of the Sahel, then to people like the Garamantes, taking news north, and only then reaching the Romans, the Carthaginians, the Egyptians, and other peoples on the northern coast of Africa. So we don't have names. We also, unfortunately, have really terrible archaeology. Because these are heavily forested areas, they're very wet, things rock. Because these are forested areas, towns and cities were probably going to be built out of wood. So, compared to the stone structures of the Garamantes or the Egyptians or other people, almost nothing would be findable other than occasional things like this, like very large ceramic sculptures from Nigeria from a people called the Nok culture. We know they had something going on, but beyond the reasonable guess that they had a large population and towns, we can't really confidently say much more at this time. What we can say is happening south in the forest belt, something that was really going to change Africa forever. And that is the expansion of yet another language family, that of the Niger-Congo languages spoken along the Niger and the Congo, and specifically the Bantu subfamily. Now, just like the Afro-Asiatic and Indo-European languages that spread with the advance of agriculture and herding, so too did these languages spread from an original homeland roughly on the border of Nigeria, Cameroon, south and east across Africa. Around sometime between about 1,500 BC, they begin expanding. And the things that carried their expansion was a package of tools and farming techniques. They had iron tools, they could make ceramics. And they were farmers going into areas where there were no previous farming. They absorbed many of the hunter-gatherer tribes who lived there into themselves, or pushed them in front of them either deeper into the forest or southwards towards into deserts, into some of the less good landscapes. But the really big thing is they had lots and lots of cattle. And moving with their herds of cattle meant that they were constantly on the move. Now, the spread of the Bantu peoples and other farming, cattle raising societies in Africa had faced two incredible challenges. One is malaria. And malaria is endemic in a lot of the wet, forested areas. Malaria, of course, having a devastating impact on people who got it before modern time. And malaria, of course, is spread by mosquitoes. The other is sleeping sickness spread to cattle by the tsetse fly. Between these two challenges to humans and to cows, spreading through this huge part of Africa would take time. And both the cattle and the people had to build up immunities. One of the most remarkable things that's happened is as humans move into the areas where malaria is most prevalent, a rare mutation of sickle cell appears, by name at random among all human populations, becomes more and more common. Because if you are a carrier of the sickle cell gene, you are not 100% immune, but malaria does not affect you greatly. And around the world, wherever malaria is most endemic, you find the highest concentration of people carrying sickle cell genes. As these develop, it becomes easier and easier for people who carry these genes to move into areas where there is malaria. Now, finally, one other language group I should mention, because their spread is possibly one of the most fantastic, is the people who made these statues found on Easter Island in the far South Pacific. These are the Austronesians, spoken on the southern islands, the name. Now, their ancestors were Neolithic farmers on the island of Taiwan, probably about 5,000 years ago. There, they developed a set of tools, food crops, plants and animals, and skills at building boats and fishing. And from Taiwan, they began to expand out into the Pacific Ocean. Their skills making pottery, growing rice, coconuts, having pigs, fishing skills, and their language. And their spread is probably the most amazing of all the language spreads. From Taiwan, they spread first southwards into the Philippines. From the Philippines, one branch spread southward into what's now Indonesia, on into Malaysia. Another branch spread down towards New Guinea, then further southeast into the Solomon Islands and the Hebrides, on to Fiji, Samoa, and eventually at Tahiti, and eventually to Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island. While yet another branch left Indonesia, and sailed all the way across the Indian Ocean to the island of Madagascar. Now, many of these islands, like Madagascar, New Zealand, Hawaii, Easter Island, Tahiti, were uninhabited when the Austronesians arrived. The sailing just to get to these places was quite incredible. And when they arrived, both New Zealand and Madagascar, they did what other first humans did. They killed off the large animals. Madagascar, having killed off the large animals, including lemurs that were perhaps as much as 10 feet tall, they established a rice farming culture using techniques they brought with them from Indonesia. Later on, there would be Arab settlers, Bantus, and Somalis from Africa who joined them. But modern Malagasy, spoken off the east coast of Africa, is more closely related to Hawaiian than it is to any African language. Of course, this is happening during the Roman period. Most of these, both the Bantu expansion and the Austronesian expansion, would not have been known back in those, quote, more advanced countries. However, what is clear is the world is getting bigger and bigger. The Romans have also been exploring north and developing relations with the peoples of Europe and Central Asia. And by the second or so century, the sense of the world is massively bigger than we've seen before, with more and more people being in some level of communication with each other. Later on, we'll come back and discuss some of the peoples to the north and northeast of the Romans, as they will impact them heavily. Meanwhile, I will queue up